The horrific discovery. It was a crisp, quiet autumn morning in early October 2018 when Mark Rutherford, a senior forestry officer, set out on his usual inspection route. Mark had always loved these moments, when the golden sunlight filtered softly through the towering oak trees, casting long, stretching shadows on the damp forest floor. The silence had a serene quality, broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath his boots and the occasional rustling of wildlife. The forest, located about 20 miles outside Portland, Oregon, was a remote and seldom visited area. So secluded, in fact, that many locals joked it was the perfect spot for hiding secrets. But for Mark, this morning was far from typical. It would be the day he stumbled upon a gruesome discovery that would shake the community to its core. As he walked deeper into the forest along a narrow trail, Mark noticed something unusual near the base of an old oak tree. It was a loose mound of dirt, slightly elevated and scattered with a layer of dried leaves clearly stacked by human hands. His curiosity piqued, but not without a touch of unease. Living in Oregon's wilderness for decades, he'd seen his share of strange things. A rogue bear carcass buried by scavengers, relics of abandoned camping trips, or even bootleggers' hidden caches from days gone by. But this felt different. He stopped in his tracks, squinting at the mound. Something pale was sticking out amidst the earthy brown. It could have been a stone, maybe even a bone from a deer. Yet the nagging thought in the back of his mind triggered something he couldn't ignore. Pulling out the collapsible spade from his field kit, Mark kneeled next to the disturbed earth and brushed away the top layer of debris with his gloved hand. And it was then, right at that moment, that he froze. Protruding from the shallow grave was not a deer's bone, but a human skull. Its stark white surface was dirty, weathered, and hauntingly eye-catching against the surrounding soil. His breath hitched. For a long, paralyzing moment, Mark couldn't move, his gaze fixed on those hollow, empty eye sockets staring back at him, as if mocking his initial curiosity. Finally regaining his composure, Mark instinctively pulled his radio from his belt and called it into the station. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Central, this is Rutherford. I'm at Sector 5C, northwest perimeter of Forest Range 23. Possible remains here. Human remains." "Say again, officer," came the reply from the dispatcher. "Human bones." His voice shook. "There's no doubt about it." Mark marked the area with bright surveyor tape, creating a perimeter as best he could before backing away, as if stepping too close would invite something sinister to awaken. He felt an eerie chill snake up his spine, despite the morning sun still warming the air. He wanted to leave the spot, yet he couldn't bring himself to turn away from the horrifying sight. It was almost as if the forest itself had secrets it was desperate to keep buried. But this secret had found its way into the daylight. By the time the field dispatch arrived, the dozen or so investigators milling about the scene had the same stunned expression Mark did when he first saw the skull. The Oregon State Police team quickly assumed control, cordoning off the area and deploying forensic investigators. Yellow crime scene tape stretched across the breadth of the forest as officers searched for other potentially disturbed areas nearby. Mark remained on the outskirts, watching quietly as they began removing soil with precision tools. Slowly and methodically, more of the skeletal remains emerged. There was something unmistakably harrowing about seeing the skeleton's partially collapsed ribcage and remnants of clothing, now brittle from exposure. The tattered scraps of what appeared to be a shirt collar poked through the dirt, and as one officer photographed the scene, another uncovered what looked like a necklace, a silver chain tangled among the disjointed vertebrae. Forensic investigator Sheila Cartwright leaned over the scene, her trained eyes narrowing as she took in the evidence. "This wasn't a natural burial," she murmured to her partner. "Whoever did this wanted it hidden but didn't put in much effort. It's sloppy." Back at the station, news of the discovery spread quickly. Though the public remained unaware at this early stage, whispers among law enforcement hinted this wasn't going to be a straightforward case. As more officers arrived to secure the scene, the forest's idyllic tranquility was replaced by the bustling hum of crime scene specialists and the muted voices of investigators speculating over coffee cups in the cold morning air. But Mark still stood there, at the edge of the taped-off area, hands shaking slightly. For years he'd walked this forest, memorizing its paths and breathing in its stillness. But now it felt foreign and sinister, no longer a sanctuary but a dark stage where someone had performed an unimaginable act. Little did anyone know that this skull, this small slice of bone unearthed in a quiet forest, would unravel one of the most brutal and baffling murder mysteries Oregon had ever seen. The police step in. When Mark's radio call came through, Detective Sarah Calloway had just arrived at the station in downtown Portland for what she thought would be a routine day. A veteran with over 15 years on the force, Sarah was no stranger to unusual cases, but something in the dispatcher's voice put her on edge as she heard the words, "Human remains discovered." Within minutes she was in her unmarked cruiser speeding toward Forest Range 23 alongside her partner Detective Mike Harrington. Both detectives shared an unspoken tension as they weaved through the winding forest road leading to the scene. "You think this is just another hiker gone missing?" Mike asked, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Sarah glanced at him, her brow furrowed. "I don't know," she said, her voice low, "but the way they described it, remains buried in shallow dirt. It doesn't sound like a simple accident. People don't end up buried like that out here." The forest loomed closer as they reached the blocked-off trailhead. Yellow tape already flapped in the breeze, and a few officers stood watch at the perimeter while crime scene technicians worked quietly near the exposed grave. The smell of damp earth and rotting vegetation hung heavy in the air, mingling with something faintly metallic and unmistakably human. Mark Rutherford, the forestry officer who had discovered the remains, stood off to the side, hands in his pockets, looking pale but composed. Sarah approached him, her boots crunching against the forest floor. "You're the one who called it in?" she asked. Mark nodded. "Yeah, I was doing my routine inspection," he began, his voice still tinged with disbelief. "Came across some disturbed earth near that old oak tree back there. Figured it could have been anything, a deer, maybe some old trash. But then..." He paused, swallowing hard. "It was a skull, definitely human. I've seen skulls before in anatomy books, but seeing one in person..." His words trailed off as he shook his head. Mike patted Mark on the shoulder and gave a reassuring nod. "You did the right thing reporting it. We'll take it from here." Sarah turned her attention to the scene where the forensic team was already hard at work, carefully brushing away dirt to expose more of the skeletal remains. Each sweep of the brush revealed fragments of a story left untold, a story Sarah and her team would now have to piece together. Forensic investigator Sheila Cartwright, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for catching even the tiniest details, waved Sarah over. "Detective, you're going to want to see this," Sheila said, crouching beside the partially unearthed ribcage. She pointed to the tattered remains of a shirt collar, and what appeared to be fragments of a silver necklace tangled near the victim's vertebrae. "Any initial thoughts?" Sarah asked, crouching to get a better view. "Female, based on the pelvic structure," Sheila said confidently. "Middle-aged, maybe mid-40s. Remains aren't fully skeletonized yet, which tells me she's probably been here less than a year. But here's what's really interesting. These fractures on the skull." Sheila tilted the skull slightly to reveal a jagged indentation. "Blunt force trauma, and not from a fall or an accident either. This was deliberate, someone smashed her head in, multiple times." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she studied the fractured skull. "So, we're looking at a homicide," she said grimly. "Looks that way," Sheila confirmed. By now, more officers had arrived to expand the search perimeter. A team swept the area for additional clues, footprints, discarded objects, anything that could point to how and why the victim ended up here. Sarah and Mike moved through the scene methodically, watching as the remains were carefully photographed and cataloged. "Detective Harrington," one of the officers called out, "you're going to want to see this." Mike walked over to where the officer stood, holding up what appeared to be a muddy, crumpled piece of fabric. It was a torn section of a shirt sleeve, stained with what looked like dried blood. "Looks like it matches the victim's shirt," Mike observed. "And if there's blood, there might be DNA," Sarah added, joining him. "Bag it and tag it. Let's hope forensics can pull something useful." As the evidence piled up, Sarah couldn't shake the unease gnawing at her. Forest Range 23 wasn't a place people simply stumbled into by accident. It was remote, tucked away from any major trails or campsites. Whoever had brought this woman out here, and killed her, had to have known the area well. Back at the station later that day, the team held their first debriefing on the case. The whiteboard at the front of the room was filled with notes and photos from the scene, all arranged around a single glaring question. Who is she, and who put her there? Captain Roy Bennett, a seasoned leader known for his calm demeanor under pressure, addressed the team. "We've got a body, we've got signs of foul play, and we've got a necklace and a bloody shirt sleeve. What we don't have is an ID or any witnesses," he said, rubbing his temples. This isn't going to be an easy one, folks, but we're not here for easy. Sarah stood up, pointing to a map of the forest displayed on the screen behind her. Here's what we know so far. The body was buried about 200 feet off the main service trail, she explained. The burial was shallow, almost as if it was done hastily. That suggests the killer either didn't have much time or didn't care if the body was found. Either way, it's careless, and we might be able to use that to our advantage. Mike chimed in, holding up a photograph of the necklace. And this, he said, could be the key to identifying her. It looks like a custom piece, not something mass-produced. If we can track where it came from, it might lead us to her or her family. The room buzzed with quiet determination as the team split up tasks, some to chase leads on missing persons reports, others to analyze the evidence from the scene. But for Sarah, one thought lingered as she headed home that evening. Whoever had buried that woman in the forest hadn't planned on her being found. And now that she had been, the killer would know the hunt was on. Forensics. Reveal the identity. The half-empty mug of stale coffee sat untouched on Detective Sarah Calloway's desk as she sifted through a mountain of autopsy reports, forensic notes, and case files. It had been 2 days since the skeletal remains had been discovered in Forest Range 23. Though the initial DNA results were rushed through the lab, it felt like an eternity to the investigative team waiting for answers. Everyone was on edge. It's gotta be someone, Sarah muttered under her breath, scrolling through photos of women reported missing in Oregon over the last year. There were dozens of names and photographs staring back at her from the screen, too many potential victims, each with their own mysteries and heartbreaks. Her phone buzzed, breaking the quiet hum of the station. It was Sheila Cartwright, the lead forensic investigator calling from the medical examiner's office. "Detective Calloway," Sheila said, her voice brisk and focused. "I have something for you. DNA match just came back. I think you should come down here." Sarah bolted upright in her seat. "On my way!" The sterile, brightly lit lab had the faint smell of disinfectant and cold steel. The sound of machines humming punctuated the atmosphere as Sarah walked into the forensic wing of the Portland County Medical Examiner's office. Sheila greeted her at the door, holding a thick folder under her arm. "Let's cut to it," Sarah said, skipping the small talk. Sheila motioned for Sarah to follow her into the evidence analysis room. On a large backlit table, photographs of skeletal remains, fragments of clothing, and other evidence from the shallow grave were neatly laid out. Sheila placed the folder on the table and opened it, revealing a DNA report. "Natalie from Biogen Lab called the match in herself," Sheila began, pointing to a printed profile. "Our victim is Jennifer Collins, 42 years old, freelance artist, lived and worked out of Portland." Sarah's brow furrowed. "Collins? Was she reported missing?" "That's the odd part," Sheila said, flipping to another page of the report. "Her family never filed a missing persons report. They thought she'd gone on one of her extended retreats. Apparently she wasn't the type to stay in one place for too long. She was off the grid long enough for someone to murder her and leave her body in the middle of nowhere," Sarah muttered. "What else do we know?" Sheila reached for her notes. "The body tells a story. Cause of death is pretty certain. She was hit multiple times with a blunt object, most likely a hammer, given the distinct impact marks on her skull. It wasn't a quick end. At least 4 fractures indicate significant force, but the first blow wasn't fatal." Sarah frowned, pacing the length of the room. "It was overkill," she said grimly. "Exactly, and it gets more specific," Sheila continued. "We pulled fibers from the scene, not only remnants of the victim's clothes but other fibers consistent with indoor carpeting. That suggests she wasn't killed in the forest. She was likely moved there post-mortem." "Classic body dump," Sarah said, her tone clipped. "Whoever killed her wanted her out of sight, but they didn't expect us to find her." "Bingo!" Sheila tapped a photo of the tattered silver necklace found at the scene. "Then there's this. The necklace was stuck in between her vertebrae when we unearthed the remains. It's custom-made, engraved with 2 initials on the back. JC. For Jennifer Collins," Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "It might give us leverage to confirm her ID with her family or at least close the loop on personal items." Sheila leaned back against the table, arms crossed. "But you know what's still bothering me?" she asked, tilting her head. "The condition of her clothing. It doesn't match the timeline. The decomposition of the body suggests she died about 6 months ago, but the fabric is almost unnaturally well preserved considering the environmental exposure. Either it's some miracle of polyester, or she wasn't dumped out there until much later than we're estimating." "You're saying the killer kept her somewhere for weeks, maybe months, before deciding to hide the body?" Sarah asked. "It's plausible," Sheila said, but there's something deliberate about every detail here. The shallow grave, the attempt to conceal her with leaves, lazy, but deliberate. Her clothing suggests she was last seen alive in something casual, a white t-shirt, jeans and a bra, but here's the catch. No shoes. Barefoot. Sarah scowled. She didn't walk into that forest on her own. Someone brought her there. Someone she probably trusted. Sheila nodded. Agree. And based on the state of her remains, I'd say she put up a fight. Defensive injuries on the small bones in her forearms. Classic signs of trying to shield her head. Back at the precinct, Sarah and her partner Mike Harrington began piecing together Jennifer Collins's life. Sarah studied her photograph from the file, a smiling woman with kind eyes, auburn hair loosely tied in a bun, and a paintbrush visible in the corner of the frame. She looked so normal, so unsuspecting. She lived in Portland her entire life, Mike said, scanning the victim's background profile. Never married, no kids, her record's clean, not even a parking ticket. But here's where it gets interesting. About a year ago, she sold her apartment and started couch surfing. Her family says she called it embracing freedom, but sounds more like a cover story. She may have been running from something. Or someone, Sarah added. Look for any restraining orders, police reports, anything that suggests she had reason to be afraid. Mike nodded, tapping away at his computer. Already on it. And start narrowing down anyone she interacted with on her art commissions, Sarah continued. Clients, gallery owners, collectors, ex-boyfriends, anyone who could have gotten close to her. Mike glanced up. You're thinking this is personal? Sarah crossed her arms and stared at Jennifer's smiling face. Mike, whoever did this wasn't just trying to kill her. They wanted her gone, disappeared. You don't bash someone's skull in and move their body to the middle of a national forest unless it's personal. Sarah knew the clock was ticking. The forensic details and DNA match had given Jennifer Collins her name back, but there was still someone out there who wanted her silenced forever. Now, the race to uncover her story and find her killer had begun. Suspicious clues. 3 days after Jennifer Collins's skeletal remains were discovered in Forest Range 23, Detective Sarah Calloway and her partner Mike Harrington were back at the precinct, spread out among stacks of evidence and digital case files. The lab results had trickled in bit by bit, and while some pieces were beginning to paint a clearer picture, others added layers of head-scratching complexity. Under the glaring fluorescence of the evidence room, Sarah leaned over the table where a series of bagged items from the crime scene were meticulously arranged. Among them was the necklace found tangled in Jennifer's vertebrae, the torn fabric from her sleeve, and most notably, fragments of a pair of shoes, a discovery made during subsequent sweeps of the burial site. We combed that forest for days and this is what came out of it, Sarah muttered, holding up the evidence bag containing half of a muddy sneaker. Why would someone dump part of her shoes so far from the grave? The scene already feels sloppy enough as it is. Mike walked in, balancing a cup of coffee dangerously close to the edge of a file folder. Or maybe it's intentional, he said, setting the cup down and joining her beside the table. If we're looking at someone who knows the terrain, they'd know this place is a pain to navigate. Leaving smaller traces along the way could have been their way of throwing us off. Throwing us off? Or amateur hour? Sarah shot back. If they really knew the terrain that well, why leave anything behind at all? Mike shrugged. Fair point. Maybe they panicked. They both paused as Sheila Cartwright walked in, carrying a new batch of forensic reports. The no-nonsense forensic investigator looked as though she hadn't slept since the forest dig began. She dropped the stack of papers onto the table and sighed. All right, detectives, Sheila began, flipping through the reports as Sarah and Mike leaned in. You're not going to believe what we found on that piece of torn fabric. The blood on the sleeve matches the victim's. But here's the kicker. We found a secondary blood type on the edges. Wait, Sarah said, straightening up. You're saying it's not just Jennifer's blood? Exactly, Sheila confirmed. The second sample came back as male, type B positive, ran through CODIS but no matches so far. Mike whistled low, leaning on the edge of the table. So either she scratched the guy mid-attack or he was bleeding from something else. What are the odds he didn't think about leaving his own DNA at the scene? Not just there, Sheila said, flipping to another report. We also ran an analysis on some of the fibers we found under her torn sleeve. They don't match the victim's clothing. It's consistent with blue polyester. Think upholstery, or a vehicle seat. Sarah's eyes narrowed. So she could have been attacked in a car before being taken into the forest. Sheila nodded. That's my working theory. And there's something else. Remember those shoe fragments we found close to the perimeter, away from the burial site? Sarah motioned for her to continue, already feeling another twist coming on. We ran tests on the shoe tread, Sheila said. It matches a local sneaker sold at a department store chain here in Portland. The soles had traces of pollen from an invasive English ivy species too, the kind that only grows near urban residential areas. She paused for impact. Long story short, the shoes weren't from out in the forest, they were brought there from somewhere else. Mike crossed his arms, wearing the look he always had when something wasn't adding up. So, we have half a pair of shoes, torn clothes, and blood that doesn't belong to the victim. Doesn't exactly scream careful planning. Unless, Sarah interjected, her voice hardening, the killer knew damn well the site would get discovered eventually. Later that day, an officer from the precinct poked his head into their room. "Detectives, we've got a hit on the silver necklace. A local jeweler just called in. Says it might have been one of theirs." Sarah and Mike didn't waste any time driving down to the shop, a small, family-owned jewelry boutique nestled in a quieter part of downtown Portland. Behind the counter, an older woman with sharp eyes wasted no time pulling a worn inventory book from the shelf. "Silver chain, custom engraving," Sarah explained, showing her a photo of the necklace. Engraved on the back were the initials, JC. The woman adjusted her glasses and squinted at it. "Ah, I remember this one," she murmured, flipping through her records. "It was definitely ours. A man came in about a year ago to have it made as a gift." "A man?" Sarah and Mike exchanged glances. "Do you remember anything about him?" "Oh, I don't forget a face," the jeweler said, smiling faintly. "Tall, wiry build, maybe in his late 40s. Had this nervous energy about him. He didn't stick around to chat much, just picked it up and left after placing the order." "Do you happen to have a name?" Mike asked, the excitement evident in his voice. The jeweler nodded, tapping her finger on the line in the book. "He gave me the name Andrew Parks." Sarah's gut twisted as she wrote the name down. "Did he pay in cash?" The jeweler frowned, thinking for a moment. "No, I believe it was a credit card transaction. That was the break they needed." Back at the precinct, Sarah immediately flagged the name and had detectives pull every record they could find. It didn't take long to discover that Andrew Parks wasn't in Portland's domestic registry, or anywhere else for that matter. By the end of the day, Sarah sat staring at her whiteboard, her marker tapping restlessly against her palm. The clues were there like pieces of a puzzle begging to be put together. "Who the hell is Andrew Parks?" she murmured to herself. Mike appeared in the doorway, his phone in hand. "I've got a potential lead," he said. "The name might be fake, but we found a credit card trail for the necklace purchase." He paused for dramatic effect. "And guess where it leads?" Sarah perked up, her tension momentarily giving way to adrenaline. Mike grinned faintly, holding up his phone, which displayed a billing address. A place about 10 miles from Forest Range 23. And just like that, the mystery moved closer to its unraveling. Complex relationships. Detective Sarah Calloway leaned back in her chair, staring at the whiteboard in her office where she'd begun sketching out connections from Jennifer Collins's life. Strings of red marker linked names, dates, and photographs scattered across the board, but the picture was far from complete. "She didn't just vanish," Sarah murmured to herself, her voice barely audible over the background buzz of the precinct. "Someone pulled her out of her life and into this nightmare." Across her desk, Mike Harrington was poring over a stack of records related to Jennifer's personal history. He tapped the edge of a file folder with his pen before tossing it onto the pile. "Well, her life wasn't exactly the kind of open book you'd hope for," Mike said as he stretched his arms. "2 divorces, both messy. Let's start with husband number 1, Stephen Rogers, married for 3 years. On paper, an amicable split, but dig a little deeper and—" he leaned forward with emphasis. "You'll find she filed a restraining order against him for harassment shortly after the divorce went through. Guy didn't take it well." Sarah wrote Stephen's name on the board and circled it. "Harassment? What kind? Just phone calls and showing up uninvited, or are we talking threats?" "A little of both," Mike replied. He flipped through the file until he reached an old police report. According to this, he showed up at her gallery, drunk of course, started yelling about how she ruined his life. Security had to escort him out. There's no record of physical violence, but— Mike gestured vaguely toward the file. "Someone doesn't just let go after that." Sarah said, tapping her marker against her chin. "Could be worth talking to him. It's been years, though. What about the second husband, Paul Simmons?" Mike smirked. "Now that's where it gets interesting. Paul Simmons, 45, construction foreman, tough-looking guy. Married Jennifer for 5 years, and let me tell you, those 5 years were anything but quiet." "Define not quiet," Sarah said, turning her attention fully to Mike. "Domestic disturbance calls, at least 3 of them while they were married. Neighbors reported loud arguments, often late at night, but Jennifer never pressed charges, never even filed a formal complaint against him. According to her sister, though, he flipped another page in the file and whistled. Jennifer confided that Paul could get violent when he drank, shoved her once, maybe more than once. But no police reports about that? Sarah asked, frustrated. Mike shook his head. None. It's all whispers and second-hand accounts. After they divorced, Simmons faded into the background, moved out of state. His alibi will probably check out, but still their history? Not pretty. Sarah scribbled Paul Simmons' name on the board under Stevens and added a thick question mark beside it. Let's bring them both in for questioning. Simmons will be harder to track down, but if he laid low and suddenly hears about Jennifer's murder... She let the sentence hang in the air. The tension deepened as Sarah's team started digging into Jennifer's relationships beyond her ex-husband's. There's someone else, Officer Carter said as he stepped into Sarah's office holding a file. Her neighbors reported seeing Jennifer with another man about 6 months before she disappeared. Sarah perked up. A boyfriend? Carter shrugged. They couldn't give me details, just said he'd visit her every other week. Older guy drove a beat-up green truck. They mentioned he looked rough around the edges, kind of a lumberjack type. Why don't we have his name yet? Sarah asked, irritation creeping into her voice. Because, and get this, Jennifer never introduced him to anyone, not even her sister, Carter replied, dropping the file on the desk. We traced the license through one neighbor who saw the plates. The truck belongs to Charles Miller, lives about 40 miles out in a rural part of Klatskanee. Sarah raised an eyebrow. And who's Charles Miller? Well, Carter started, glancing at the file. He's a 58-year-old former forestry worker, spent the last 2 decades in jobs nobody stays in long, logging, hunting guide, some odd construction gigs here and there. But the kicker? He paused dramatically. What? Sarah pressed. He's got a sealed record. Mike perked up at that. Sealed? What is it, juvenile stuff? Nope, domestic violence charges from '95, Carter clarified. His ex-wife filed for both a restraining order and a divorce within the same year. Records suggest she moved halfway across the country to get away from him. The room went quiet for a moment as the weight of that revelation settled. Sarah folded her arms. So, we have an older guy with a temper and a history of abuse who was apparently spending quiet evenings with our victim, and no one had a clue he existed? Seems like it, Carter replied. And here's the best part, he's still in the area. Later that afternoon, Sarah and Mike drove out to Klatskanee, where Charles Miller lived in a small, run-down cabin tucked behind a line of spruce trees. A rusty pickup truck, probably the green one neighbors mentioned, sat parked in the dirt driveway. Sarah stepped out of the car and approached the front door while Mike hung back, scanning the area. The air was cold and damp, the early signs of rain clinging to the wind. Sarah knocked firmly. The door creaked open after a long moment. A scruffy, wiry man appeared, his face hardened with suspicion. Charles Miller? Sarah asked, showing her badge. Yeah, what of it? What's this about? His tone was defensive, his stare unwavering. We're investigating the death of Jennifer Collins, Sarah said evenly, watching Miller's reaction closely. His jaw tightened, and Sarah didn't miss the flicker of something in his eyes. I don't know anything about that, Miller stammered, stepping back slightly. But you did know her, Sarah pressed. Neighbors saw you with her, 6 months ago. Every other week, apparently. Want to explain that? Miller's gaze darted to the side. We were friends. Just friends. I haven't seen her since last fall. Funny, because she went missing not long after that, Sarah said, leaning in a little. And now her body's been found. Care to tell me where you were the night she disappeared? Miller's hands clenched into fists, his demeanor shifting. You've got no right to come here accusing me of whatever this is. I didn't do anything to Jennifer. Then you won't mind answering more questions down at the station, Mike said, stepping up beside Sarah. Miller's shoulders sagged, his defiance beginning to crack. Fine, I'll answer your damn questions. But I didn't hurt her. I liked Jennifer. She was nice. They escorted Miller to the car, the interrogation yet to begin. But one thing was already clear to Sarah. Charles Miller wasn't just another name on the board. He was a storm cloud hovering over their case, and she would get to the bottom of it, even if it meant ripping his story apart piece by piece. A new suspect emerges. The precinct conference room buzzed with a quiet intensity as Detective Sarah Calloway mapped out the growing list of suspects on the whiteboard. Strings of red connected photos, but one face stood out amongst the other names. Charles Miller, the gruff ex-forestry worker with a checkered past and a suspicious connection to Jennifer Collins. You know, Mike Harrington said, leaning back in his chair, this guy checks way too many boxes. He knew the victim, lived close to Forest Range 23, and has a history of being violent. There's no way we can ignore him. But something about this doesn't sit right. Sarah turned from the board, marker still in hand. What doesn't sit right? He's got motive, opportunity, and proximity. Miller isn't exactly airing alibis either. Mike shrugged, taking a sip of his lukewarm coffee. Agreed. But it's too neat. A man like Miller doesn't strike me as someone who keeps loose ends hidden long enough for us to stumble into them. If he did this, we'd have more evidence tying him directly to the crime. Sarah nodded thoughtfully, but unresolved tension brewed under her professional exterior. She felt it too. There was something either too obvious about Miller or just too sloppy. Still, sloppy or not, Miller's history earned him a closer look. That evening, as the two detectives made their way to interview Miller again, Sarah couldn't shake the image of him standing stiffly on his dingy front porch, evading her direct questions with a barely concealed nervous energy. Sure, some of his nervousness might have been connected to his past, but was it more than that? When they arrived, the rickety cabin sat in near darkness, the only sign of life being the faint flicker of a dim porch light. The rain from earlier had tapered off into a steady drizzle that made everything feel colder than it should. Miller greeted them at the door, his usual scowl tucked beneath his wiry beard. "Didn't we already go through this?" he grumbled, stepping back reluctantly to let them in. "We're just tying off some loose ends, Mr. Miller," Sarah said, her tone calm yet firm. She didn't let him see any hint of doubt in her face. "Let's have another little chat." Inside, the air carried an overwhelming scent of damp wood and old coffee. Miller sat in a sagging armchair, his hands gripping the armrests tightly, his fingers twitching in small, agitated movements. "So, let's go back," Sarah started, taking a seat across from him while Mike leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Jennifer Collins. You two knew each other, right?" "I already told you, yeah," Miller muttered. "She was a friend. You can ask anyone around here. She was nice to me, and I was nice to her, that's all." "Nice enough to visit her every other week, huh?" Mike cut in, raising an eyebrow. "That's a lot for just being nice." Sounds like there was more going on. Miller shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting toward Sarah for a moment before falling to the floor. "We were close, that's no crime." "No, it's not," Sarah replied smoothly. "But when your girlfriend, or whatever she was, turns up dead, buried in a shallow grave in the woods not far from your place, it's our job to start asking questions." Miller's jaw tightened, and he leaned forward slightly, his voice sharp. "I didn't kill Jennifer. Hell, I haven't even seen her since last fall." "So then, where were you the night she disappeared?" Sarah pressed, her tone unrelenting. Miller hesitated, his hands clenching the edges of the armrest. But before he could answer, Mike tossed something into his lap, a photo of the necklace found with Jennifer's remains. The silver chain gleamed dully in the dim light, and Miller froze, staring at it as if it might burn him. "This look familiar?" Mike asked casually, though his eyes studied Miller like a hawk. "We traced it to a jeweler in Portland. Guess what? A guy matching your description ordered it about a year ago, paid with a credit card. Want to explain that?" Miller's face drained of color, and his breathing grew shallow. "It was a gift," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "A gift for Jennifer, right?" Sarah prodded, leaning forward in her chair. "You cared about her, enough to buy her custom jewelry. But then something must have happened. A fight? Did she tell you it was over? Did it come to that?" "No," Miller shot back, his voice shaking with sudden rage. "We didn't fight. She was leaving anyway. She told me she couldn't keep seeing me, said she needed to get away from everyone in her life. That's why she was moving out of Portland. People were using her, that's what she said." "And you believed her?" Sarah asked, her voice calm, though her gaze was razor-sharp. Miller threw his hands into the air. "Why wouldn't I? Jennifer never lied to me. She wasn't like the others." "The others?" Mike jumped on the phrase. "What others, Charles? Did she have enemies we don't know about?" Miller fell silent, gripping the arms of the chair again. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and defeated. "There was this other guy she talked about, someone from Portland, an old boyfriend or something. She said he wouldn't stop bothering her, kept sending her messages, calling her, said he'd ruin her if she didn't take him back." Sarah shot a look at Mike, who immediately pulled out his notebook. "Got a name?" he asked. Miller shook his head. I think his name was Andrew, that's all I know." He slumped back into the chair, his shoulders sagging. "I swear to God I didn't hurt Jennifer, I wouldn't." Later that night, back at the precinct, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Miller was hiding something, even if he wasn't directly involved in the murder. But the mention of Andrew? That was new, and it sent a jolt through Sarah's mind. It tied back to the mysterious name on the credit card used to buy the necklace, Andrew Parks. Could Miller have inadvertently handed them their next lead? Mike dropped into the chair at the desk across from her, throwing a file down between them. So, we dig into Miller some more? Or do we start figuring out who this Andrew guy is? We do both, Sarah said decisively. Miller might not have killed her, but I don't believe for a second he's got no idea what happened. And if this Andrew Parks guy is real, he's about to get a knock on his door. Key evidence. The precinct walls felt as though they were closing in on Sarah Calloway as she sifted through the evidence files yet again. Days into the case, the clues they had were tantalizing but incomplete, like trying to finish a jigsaw puzzle with missing pieces. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples, when Mike Harrington burst into the room holding a sealed evidence bag and wearing a look she recognized, the kind that screamed, "We've got something." "You're gonna want to sit down for this one," Mike said as he tossed the evidence bag onto her desk. Inside was a sleek yet blood-streaked blade, the kind of knife that looked functional, not decorative. "Tell me that's not what I think it is," Sarah said, sitting up straighter, her eyes narrowing. "Oh, it's exactly what you think," Mike replied. "During the second sweep of Charles Miller's cabin, this bad boy showed up stuffed in a toolbox in the back closet. Detectives almost missed it, buried under a pile of junk." Sarah inspected the knife through the sealed bag, tilting it under the fluorescent light. The dark stains on the blade still hadn't lost their sinister hue. "Blood?" Mike nodded. "Lots of it. Lab's already on it, but I don't think we need to guess, do we?" "And the handle?" Sarah asked, motioning toward the grip. "Prints?" "Ah, now that's where it gets good," Mike said, a sly grin tugging at his face. "Miller's prints, clear as day. Left index finger, right thumb. He didn't even try to clean it." Sarah's lips tightened into a grim line. "So, we've got his fingerprints on a bloody knife. Let me guess, there's more?" "Oh, absolutely." Mike grabbed another evidence bag from the folder he'd brought in. This one contained a stack of handwritten letters, smeared slightly with age but still legible in delicate cursive writing. "We also found these, hidden in the same toolbox." Sarah raised a skeptical eyebrow as she reached for the file accompanying the bag. "What are these? Letters?" Mike leaned on the edge of her desk. "Love letters, apparently, from Jennifer Collins to Miller, dated throughout the last year, just months before she went missing." Wait, let me get this straight," Sarah said, holding up a hand. "The man we've been grilling for days about his friendly relationship with Jennifer neglected to mention that he was holding on to personal letters from her this whole time?" Mike gave an incredulous laugh. "Apparently, good old Charles thought we'd never dig through his cluttered little home far enough to find them." Sarah's eyes scanned the letter at the top of the stack, murmuring parts aloud as she read. "You've been my rock through everything. I don't know how I'd survive without your support." She trailed off, furrowing her brow. "This isn't just a fling, these sound intimate." "Exactly what I was thinking," Mike chimed in. "And here's the cherry on the messed up sundae. The last letter, dated 2 months before she disappeared, mentions a fight they had. Jennifer wrote that she was starting to feel uncomfortable about how Charles was acting, something about him being overly possessive. She said she needed some time apart." Sarah immediately flipped to the last letter. Jennifer's words were written in uneven strokes, almost shaky. "Charles, you're scaring me. I feel like I can't breathe when you're around. I need space. Please don't come by my studio anymore." Sarah pressed her lips together, silently connecting the dots. "This doesn't look good for Miller," she said, leaning back in her chair. "Possessive behavior, evidence he didn't want us to find, and now we've got a potential weapon in play." "Oh, but wait," Mike said, lifting a finger dramatically. "It gets worse." Sarah gave him an impatient look. "What now?" "Well," Mike continued, "our lab techs ran the letters through for latent fingerprints. Want to guess what they found?" "Tell me." "Miller's prints, and one other set that doesn't match Jennifer or anyone else in CODIS," Mike said, crossing his arms. "We've got an unidentified second party handling these letters." Sarah blinked in surprise. "Wait, you're saying someone else touched these letters apart from Miller? Could be someone Miller shared them with? Or," Mike shrugged, "someone who was directly involved in what happened to Jennifer." "Damn," Sarah said under her breath. "So now we're back to playing the who else was there game." Hours later, the interrogation room at the precinct was cloaked in tension as Sarah and Mike sat across from Charles Miller, the bloody knife and bagged letters visibly placed on the table between them. Miller hunched forward, his hands clasped together so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. "I already told you everything I know," Miller snapped, his voice breaking slightly. His eyes flicked to the knife and then back at Sarah. "That's not mine." "Oh, really?" Sarah said dryly, leaning back in her chair. "Because funny enough, your fingerprints are all over it." Miller's jaw clenched. Okay, fine, sure, it's my knife. I use it for hunting, all right? That doesn't prove anything. Mike leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. A knife covered in blood matching the victim's, found hiding in your closet, doesn't prove anything. Sure, Charles, tell me another one. I didn't kill her, Miller snapped, slamming his fists on the metal table. Then explain the letters, Sarah said, her voice calm yet cutting. She slid one of the love letters across the table toward him. You were keeping these, weren't you? And I'm willing to bet the handwriting's hers. And this last one, she was scared of you. Seems pretty damning, don't you think? Miller shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting between the detectives. She didn't understand, he muttered. I told her I didn't mean to get so attached. I just liked her, a lot, but I didn't kill her. Sarah drilled her gaze into him. So, why hide the knife, Charles? I didn't hide it, Miller shouted. I forgot it was even there. I haven't used it in months. Sarah exchanged a glance with Mike before speaking in a measured tone. Then how do you explain not just Jennifer's blood but another person's prints on these letters? Looks like you weren't the only one involved in her life, or her murder. Miller froze, his mouth opening briefly before shutting again. His face darkened as though he'd realized something but wasn't ready to say it out loud. You're hiding something, Mike said sharply. If there's someone else we need to know about, now's the time, Charles. Miller leaned back in his chair, his chest heaving slightly. Fine, he muttered. There was someone else hanging around her, some guy. She said his name was Andrew, I think. I don't know him, but she told me he started bothering her when I stopped coming by. She said he wouldn't leave her alone. Back in the squad room, Sarah's hands moved rapidly as she updated the whiteboard. Above Charles Miller's photo, she scrawled a single name in thick red ink, Andrew Parks. The pieces of evidence, the knife, the letters, the additional fingerprints, all pointed towards something larger. They had Miller backed into a corner, but Andrew Parks was now a shadow creeping into the forefront of their investigation. Was he the key to the whole case, or just another layer in Jennifer's twisted life of secrets? Andrew Parks, Sarah murmured to herself, her eyes fixed on the name. Time to find you. A shocking confession. The interrogation room hummed with an oppressive silence. The single overhead light over the metal table cast sharp shadows under Charles Miller's eyes, which darted nervously between Detective Sarah Calloway and Mike Harrington. Outside, the precinct buzzed with activity, but within the walls of this small room, time felt as though it had frozen. The bloody knife, the stack of love letters, and a photo of Jennifer Collins's skeletal remains sat neatly in front of Miller like a grim collage of damning evidence. His hands clenched his chair so tightly the veins on his arms bulged. Sarah could see a storm brewing in him, somewhere between rage, fear, and guilt. You've been lying to us this entire time, Charles, Sarah began, her voice calm but pointed. And now, we've got everything we need. The prints, the weapon, the letters. Every single piece points to you. I already told you, Miller barked, his voice hoarse and trembling. I didn't kill Jennifer, I didn't. Sarah leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. Then tell us the damn truth, Charles, because right now, all I see is a man whose obsession went too far. She wanted space from you, she was scared of you, but you couldn't handle it. Could you? Miller slammed his hands down on the table as he stood up, the chair screeching backward. You don't know what the hell you're talking about. Mike, calm as a stone, leaned back against the wall with his arms crossed. Sit down, Charles. Shouting doesn't make you look any less guilty. For a moment Miller froze, fists clenched at his sides. After a standoff-like pause, he collapsed back into his chair, his body deflating like a balloon. Sweat gleamed on his forehead as he exhaled a long, ragged breath. I didn't mean for it to happen, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's eyes sharpened. What didn't you mean to happen, Charles? He wouldn't meet her eyes. His fingers nervously drummed the edges of the table. She started accusing me, he whispered finally, his voice wavering. Said I was lying to her, said I was hiding money. It wasn't true, at first, but she kept pushing, kept threatening to tell people, said she'd ruin me, my job, the life I built here, all of it. Sarah and Mike exchanged a quick glance, their instincts confirming what they already suspected. What was she threatening to expose, Charles? Sarah pressed. Some bad decisions, Miller stammered, his eyes flickering to the photo of Jennifer's remains like he couldn't look at them for more than a second. I was under the table on a couple of logging deals, slipping cash out of the accounts, small stuff at first, but she got wind of it. She said she didn't care about the money, but I knew what that meant. She had me by the throat. And that's when things escalated, didn't they? Sarah said, her tone taking on a sharper edge. Miller shot a glare at her, but it lacked conviction. His body sagged further into the chair, shoulders slumped. She said she'd go to the cops if I didn't admit it to her. I was trying to keep her calm, keep her from doing something stupid, but when I went over there, when I tried to talk to her, things got out of control. Mike broke his silence, his voice cutting through the tension like a razor. Out of control is an understatement, Charles. You buried her in the middle of a damn forest. I didn't mean to kill her, Miller snapped, his voice cracking. We were arguing. She had this look like she was disgusted with me. I tried to grab her arm just to make her listen, but she pushed me and I shoved back. It was instinct. And that's when you hit her, wasn't it? Sarah's voice was cold and precise now, the compassion gone. Miller swallowed hard, his jaw trembling. She fell! She hit the back of her head on the table, there! There was so much blood, but she wasn't dead! My God, she wasn't dead! He was shaking now, his hands gripping his hair near the scalp. Sarah leaned forward, her voice steely. What did you do next? I panicked, Miller admitted, his voice quivering. She was screaming, calling me a monster, saying she'd ruin me. I didn't think. I just grabbed something. The knife was there on the counter. Mike's voice turned grim. And you decided to silence her for good. Miller slammed his fists against the table, tears welling in his eyes. I didn't decide anything, it just happened. I couldn't stop. His breath came in short, gasping bursts. When she stopped moving, I knew it was over. I knew there was no coming back from this. So you dumped her, Sarah said, her tone hard as concrete. I had no choice, Miller shouted, his voice wild. What was I supposed to do? Leave her there? Call the cops? She was dead because of me. Silence fell over the room, the only sound the dull hum of a ventilation fan overhead. For a moment, even Sarah had to steady herself against the palpable weight of his confession. And the forest? Sarah asked, her voice softer now, though no less determined. Why dump her there? Miller buried his face in his hands. It's remote, quiet. I thought... He choked on the words, his voice muffled. I thought no one would find her. I dug a hole. It was shallow because I couldn't bring myself to go any deeper, and then I left. Mike shook his head, his arms crossed. You didn't even clean up the scene, Charles. Didn't think for a second about the blood you left behind, the evidence you shoved in your closet. Everything you did screamed panic. Miller looked up at him, his face pale and hollow. I didn't want to do it, you have to believe me. I didn't mean for this to happen. Sarah stared at him for a long moment, then quietly rose from her seat. She gestured toward the door, signaling that the uniformed officers waiting outside should escort Miller to holding. As he was handcuffed and shuffled out of the room, Sarah leaned on the table, staring at the crime scene photo. All that chaos. Over a man who couldn't control his lies, Mike muttered behind her. Sarah didn't reply immediately. She was already thinking 2 steps ahead. Let's wrap it up, she said finally. Get the formal charges filed and check the evidence one more time. I want to make sure nothing about this accident story slips through the cracks. Mike gave her a nod, but it was clear neither of them would sleep easy that night. Even with a confession, there was something deeply unsettling about how quickly one man's desperation had turned deadly. The primary crime scene. Looming clouds painted the sky a sullen gray as Sarah Calloway and Mike Harrington made their way down a desolate dirt road just outside Forest Range 23. In the back seat of their unmarked SUV sat Charles Miller, his expression vacant as he stared out the window. His earlier confession had brought them to this forgotten corner of the woods where he claimed Jennifer Collins's death had unfolded before the desperate attempt to cover his tracks. So this is it? Sarah asked sharply, glancing at Miller through the rearview mirror. This is where it all went down? Miller shifted uncomfortably, his hands fidgeting against the cuffs around his wrists. Yeah, just down there, he mumbled, gesturing toward a sloping pathway obscured by oak trees, their skeletal branches reaching out like claws. Mike stood at the bottom of the trail, pulling on gloves as the precinct's crime scene team unloaded their gear. Funny how he suddenly remembers after days of denying everything, he muttered under his breath. Sarah joined him, also gloved up and carrying her notepad. Guilt has a way of eroding the strongest lies, she replied. Turning to Miller, she gestured for him to step forward. All right, Charles, lead the way. The crunch of leaves beneath their boots punctuated the otherwise unnatural silence. The air was damp, heavy with the mingling scents of mud and decaying foliage. Miller moved ahead slowly, flanked by officers keeping close watch. His steps were hesitant, like he hoped he'd been wrong about this place. This is all over for you, Charles, Mike said bluntly, his tone devoid of sympathy. You may as well tell it like it is. Spare us the half-truths. Miller didn't reply, his attention solely fixed on the faint opening in the tree line just ahead. He stopped abruptly near a patch of uneven ground littered with debris, broken branches, patches of moss, and dirt that looked unnaturally disturbed. "Right here," he said hoarsely, pointing at the ground. "This is where it happened." Sarah folded her arms and took a moment to scrutinize the area. The crime scene unit moved into position behind her, setting out flags and markers. "You're saying this is where you killed her before taking her body deeper into the forest?" Miller swallowed hard, nodding. "Yeah, inside the cabin, then I dragged her here to bury her." "That cabin you mentioned?" Sarah pressed. "Where is it?" Miller hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "A little further up the hill. I didn't think anyone would find it. I haven't been back there since." "Convenient," Mike quipped, snapping his fingers to get the attention of two crime scene techs. "You heard him. Scope the area for tire tracks, tools, anything that matches his confession." As the techs moved off to search, Sarah kneeled by the disturbed earth Charles indicated. Her gloved fingers brushed over the soil, soft, loose, like it had been dug and filled hastily but recently churned by rain and roots. She turned her head toward the forensics team, raising her voice. "We'll need full soil analysis over here, top to bottom." "Nervous much, Charles?" Mike said, standing over Miller, who now looked pale and visibly shaken. The tears from his earlier confession were gone, replaced by a kind of numbed resignation. "It was dark," Charles stammered, his voice cracking slightly. "I didn't think anyone would—" Sarah glanced at him sharply. "Didn't think anyone would notice shallow dirt and dump debris in broad daylight? You're not exactly a genius for a forestry worker, are you?" Mike smirked, pulling out a small notebook. "Let's recap. Dragging the body, how long did that take, Charles?" I don't know, it felt like hours," Miller murmured. "I tried to do everything quietly. The forest, it's so still at night. I thought the silence would drown me out." "Guess what?" Mike said flatly. "It didn't." Nearby, one of the crime scene techs called out, "Detectives, you're gonna want to see this!" Sarah and Mike exchanged glances before heading toward the tech. They found him squatted next to a tree with fresh scuff marks at its base. "Looks like he wasn't telling us everything," the tech said, pointing to a half-buried tarp tangled in roots and mud. The once bright fabric was stained with dark streaks that had faded with time but hadn't vanished completely. "What's that?" Mike asked, kneeling beside the tech, his jaw tightening. "Tarp's covered in dirt and organic debris, guessing he used it to move her body. Look at the drag marks leading back toward the trail." Mike's head snapped toward Miller, his expression sharp. "You said you carried her. That doesn't look like carrying, Charles." Miller didn't answer, his gaze fixed on his shoes. Sarah raised a hand toward the tech. "Bag it. Photograph every detail before it's moved." Her tone sharpened as she turned back to Miller. "What else, Charles? What else did you forget to mention?" He stammered, his breath shallow. "I didn't know what I was doing, okay? I panicked." "Panic doesn't explain every misstep here," Sarah said tersely. "Dragging a tarp, using tools, burying someone in shallow dirt, that's not panic. That's premeditation poorly executed." As the forensics team examined the disturbed soil, ground-penetrating radar revealed fragments buried deeper than expected, bones, fibers, and what appeared to be part of a bracelet matching one Jennifer was said to frequently wear. The atmosphere grew heavy as more pieces of her story emerged from the ground. Mike joined Sarah by the excavation site as more forensic officers arrived to secure the area. "So, what are we thinking, boss? We've got a corpse site, transport tools, a confessed suspect, and his knife covered in blood. Wrap it with a bow?" Sarah shook her head, scanning the chaos of the scene with a determined glare. "Not yet. Something's still off." "You think he's lying?" Mike asked skeptically. "Look at him. The guy's unraveling faster than a cheap sweater." "Maybe he's unraveling," Sarah admitted. "Doesn't mean he's told us everything." Her eyes flicked back toward Miller, now sitting on a fallen log, his face in his hands. Shaking her head, she pocketed her notepad. "This isn't over, not yet." It was nearing evening when the search expanded uphill to the cabin Miller had mentioned. An old, abandoned structure emerged through the dense undergrowth, its wooden frame warped from years of neglect. The interior smelled of mildew and damp rot, but the unmistakable signs of disturbance were there: overturned chairs, dried stains on the floor, and a blanket stashed in a corner that had clearly been used to wrap something heavy. "Looks like our primary scene, no doubt about it," Mike said, squatting next to the stains and snapping photos. "Blood spatter analysis is going to eat this place alive." Sarah stood in the middle of the room, letting her eyes drift across the hollow, broken space. She ran a hand over the surface of a counter, frozen in thought. He did more than panic. Either he's holding on to more details, or someone else was here. "You seriously think he had help?" Mike asked, voice tinged with doubt. Or competition, Sarah muttered, her voice low but steely. Push him harder, let's find out. A terrifying motive. The interrogation room felt colder than usual. The kind of chill that wasn't caused by the air conditioning but by the weight of the confessions bleeding out of Charles Miller. The metal table between him and Detectives Sarah Calloway and Mike Harrington was littered with carefully placed evidence: Jennifer Collins's love letters, the blood-streaked knife, and a forensic report printed in bold black ink. Stretched across Miller's face was now a hollow, defeated expression, his lies stripped away piece by piece. But Sarah wasn't done. Not yet. You confessed to killing her, Charles, Sarah said, her voice sharp like a blade. You told us about the fight, how she fell, how it ended in panic. But what I want to know, what I need to understand, is why it escalated so fast. Because panic doesn't explain the brutality of what you did to Jennifer. Miller didn't respond immediately. His hands rested limply in his lap, his head hanging forward, eyes fixed on the table as though it might offer some escape. Look at me, Charles, Sarah pressed, leaning in closer. When he didn't respond, she slammed her palm down, the sound echoing through the sparse room. I need you to tell me the truth. Why did you kill Jennifer? Miller flinched, his shoulders hunched inward like a man expecting a physical blow. Finally, after long, agonizing seconds, he mumbled, You wouldn't understand. Mike snorted from his side of the table, his arms crossed over his chest, unimpressed by Miller's weak attempt to stall. That's where you're wrong, Charles. Try us. We've seen it all. Jealousy, obsession, money, power. So what was it? Why did you kill her? What was so important that you couldn't just walk away? Miller's lips twitched slightly, his jaw tightening as though he were physically holding in the words. It was like watching a dam about to burst. You don't know what it's like, he said at last, his voice low and trembling. To have someone who makes you feel whole, only to realize they're playing you. Playing you? Sarah repeated, her tone calculated. It was the kind of nudge a detective gave when they knew more was coming. What do you mean by that? Miller's hands began to shake and he gripped the chair's arms as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. She lied to me. She said I was different. I thought she needed me, but all she wanted was to control me. Control you how? Mike leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. She didn't love me, Miller hissed suddenly, his voice breaking. All those letters, those goddamn sweet words. You're my rock. I couldn't do this without you. It was all bullshit. I found out she was stringing me along. Sarah's expression didn't waver, but inside she felt the pieces of a darker puzzle starting to fall into place. What do you mean, Charles? Stringing you along for what? She dug into my life, Miller spat, his words spilling out like poison. Found out about the money, He hesitated even as the words came tumbling out. I took a little extra here and there from the logging deals, not much, just enough to get by. She found out, made it sound like some big criminal scam. And what did she do with that information? Sarah asked, her tone low but insistent, the words slicing through his agitation like a scalpel. She threatened me, Miller choked, his voice rising. Said she was going to tell the authorities. Said she'd drag my name through the mud, ruin everything I'd worked for. My whole life destroyed, just like that. He slammed his fists against the table, startling both detectives. Mike didn't flinch, keeping his tone neutral. So you killed her because she threatened to expose you? No, I didn't mean to, Miller snarled, his voice trembling with rage but tinged with desperation. She kept pushing. She kept saying I was worthless, that I was stupid to think I could fool her. She said I was disposable. His voice broke on the last word, his eyes filling with tears. Sarah eyed him carefully, her instincts firing on every emotion he displayed. So you panicked? She asked softly. Or was it more than panic, Charles? For a moment, the room was so silent that even the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed deafening. Miller's breath hitched. I didn't panic, Miller admitted at last, hanging his head in defeat. I snapped. The words hung in the air like a noose tightening around him. She said she had no reason to need me anymore, he continued, his voice cracking under the weight of his confession. Said I was dumb enough to steal, dumb enough to love her, and dumb enough to think she'd ever care about someone like me. It wasn't just the money. She made me feel like nothing. You wanted control back, Mike said flatly, finishing the thought. Miller nodded, tears slipping down his face now. I just wanted her to stop. I wanted her to see what she'd done to me. But when it was over, when I realized what I'd done, he gestured helplessly toward the evidence in front of him, his voice trembling. I didn't know what to do. I took her to the forest. I thought it would bury everything. Her, the fight, the lies. Guess what, Charles? Sarah said, her tone icy. It didn't bury anything. It only made you look worse. Miller didn't respond. He simply stared at his hands as though the blood on them was visible to him even now. Later that night, Sarah and Mike sat in her office, the sound of Miller's confession still echoing in their minds. "Well, that was unsettling," Mike said, leaning back in his chair and staring up at the ceiling. "All of this because he snapped over being manipulated? Jesus. The guy's a walking powder keg." Sarah didn't respond at first, her focus still on the file in front of her. "It's deeper than that," she murmured. "He wanted to matter to her. He needed her to validate him. But when he realized she saw him as nothing more than a pawn, he broke." "No kidding," Mike muttered. "You think she was stringing him along intentionally?" Sarah frowned, her fingers tapping the edge of her desk. "It's possible. Or maybe she didn't think he'd take things this far. Either way, it doesn't justify what he did." Mike sighed, shaking his head. "Love, obsession, greed. It's a hell of a cocktail for a murder motive." "More like a recipe for disaster," Sarah replied grimly. She stared at the photo of Jennifer Collins one last time before closing the file, her jaw tightening. "Let's make sure the jury sees it that way too." The trial and sentence. The courtroom buzzed with hushed conversations as reporters jotted down notes and spectators filled the rows like an audience awaiting a pivotal act in a tragedy. The air felt electric, thick with anticipation as Charles Miller, flanked by two deputies, was escorted into the defendant's seat. His once tough, defiant demeanor had wilted into something more hollow, his eyes sunken and face pale under the harsh lighting. This was the moment his crimes, his lies, and his motives would finally be laid bare before a jury. Detective Sarah Calloway sat at the prosecutor's table, her notepad open but untouched. She didn't need to review her notes. After months of chasing Miller, she had etched every detail of the grim case into her memory. Seated beside her was Mike Harrington, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable but quietly seething. They had pulled every string, followed every lead, and painstakingly built a case that could leave no cracks for Miller to slip through. In walked the prosecutor, Nicole West, a commanding presence with sharp features and a tone that didn't waver, no matter how intimidating the defense tried to be. She adjusted her glasses slightly, scanning the faces of the jury as she approached the bench to begin her opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," West began, her voice steady and clear, "today you'll hear the story of a man consumed by greed, jealousy, and rage, a man who claimed to love Jennifer Collins but ultimately took away her life in the most selfish act imaginable." A slight murmur rippled through the gallery as West pointed to Charles Miller at the defendant's table. He avoided eye contact, his head slightly bowed as though trying to shirk the weight of her words. "She trusted him," West continued, her voice cracking just enough to sound genuine, "and he betrayed that trust in unimaginable ways. He used her to fill his own emptiness, and when she pushed back, when she demanded the respect she deserved, he silenced her forever." With a flick of her wrist, West held up a photo of the bloody knife recovered from Miller's cabin, the one Sarah and Mike had painstakingly tracked down. "This knife," West said, pausing for emphasis, "isn't just a piece of evidence. It's a window into Charles Miller's state of mind. In a fit of rage, born out of his overwhelming fear of being exposed, he took this weapon and made the irreversible choice to end Jennifer Collins's life." Miller visibly squirmed in his seat, his lips pressing tightly together, but he didn't utter a word. Over at the defense table, his lawyer, Joe Creed, leaned in and whispered something in his ear. Whatever was said wasn't enough to calm the tension radiating off Miller's entire body. The first days of the trial were characterized by a deluge of forensic evidence. Sarah and Mike were both called to the stand to testify about the discovery of Jennifer's remains, the bloody knife, and Miller's shaky confession in the interrogation room. The prosecution's case was meticulous, but it was Nicole West's ability to narrate each piece of evidence like chapters in a tragic story that left the jury hanging onto her every word. "Miller's fingerprints were on the knife," West said during cross-examination of a forensic specialist. "The blood found on it belonged exclusively to Jennifer Collins. The drag marks in the forest, the tarp, the shallow grave, does any of it suggest desperation, or does it suggest premeditated disposal?" The forensic expert nodded firmly. "It indicates a deliberate attempt to both transport and conceal the body." By the fourth day of the trial, Jennifer's sister, Amanda Collins, took the stand. Her tear-filled testimony drove home the human toll of the crime. "She always called him kind," Amanda said between sobs, clutching a tissue tightly in her hand. "She said he was lonely and misunderstood, and that she wanted to help him. But I told her," her voice cracked, I told her to be careful. I knew something wasn't right about him. I just didn't know she'd end up like this." Her testimony hit the courtroom with the weight of a wrecking ball. Sarah watched Miller tightrope between indifference and barely controlled frustration. Every word Amanda spoke felt like a cut to his already bleeding reputation. When it was the defense's turn, Joe Creed played his hand exactly as Sarah had predicted. He painted Miller as a broken man, a victim of his circumstances, someone who had snapped under the psychological strain of Jennifer's supposed manipulation. "Yes," my client confessed, Creed admitted during his opening argument, pacing dramatically in front of the jury as though delivering a sermon. "But you must ask yourselves, was this an intentional act of murder, or was it a terrible mistake made by someone who was desperate and overwhelmed?" Nicole West didn't flinch. She countered every point Creed made with an unshakable calmness that bordered on surgical precision. Desperation isn't the same as bludgeoning someone, dragging their body into the woods and burying them like garbage. Let's not confuse regret with innocence. The trial reached its peak when Nicole unveiled the letters. Handwritten and emotional, they painted an intimate yet dark picture of Miller's relationship with Jennifer, revealing both the extent of his obsession and her growing fears of him. In particular, the last letter, where Jennifer begged Miller to stay away, rang like a haunting echo in the silent courtroom as Nicole read it aloud. "You're scaring me, Charles. I feel like I can't breathe when you're around. Please don't come by my studio anymore. I need space." Sarah caught a glimpse of one juror subtly wipe away tears, while another clenched their jaw in visible anger. Miller's stoic mask cracked briefly, revealing a flash of helpless fury before he forced himself to look away. After 2 weeks of evidence, testimonies, and tear-streaked faces, the case was handed to the jury. The tension inside the courtroom was suffocating as everyone waited for a verdict. Hours dragged into a full day before the jury finally filed back into the room. "Will the defendant please rise?" the judge intoned. Miller stood, shaky and pale, his cuffed wrists clinking softly against the table. Sarah looked at him, feeling that familiar sense of resolution mixed with exhaustion that came after months of grueling work. All she could think was, this is it, justice for Jennifer. The foreperson cleared her throat, her voice steady. "On the count of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty." A collective exhale rippled across the room. Jennifer's family hugged one another tightly, tears of relief streaming down their faces. Sarah caught Amanda's glance, offering her a small nod, a silent acknowledgement that they had fought for Jennifer and they had won. The sentence came swiftly, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Miller didn't react. He just stared forward, his face blank, as though his mind had finally shut down. As he was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Sarah felt a hollow satisfaction settle over her. Justice had been served, but no sentence could undo the pain Jennifer's family carried or quiet the echoes of Miller's lies and rage. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed as Amanda addressed the crowd with trembling hands. "My sister didn't deserve what happened to her," she said, her voice thick with grief. "But today, we got justice, and I can finally begin to let her rest." Sarah and Mike stood a few feet back, watching the scene unfold. "Another one in the books," Mike muttered, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Yeah," Sarah replied, though her voice lacked triumph. "But it never feels finished, does it?" Mike glanced at her, offering a faint smile. "No, but we make sure people like him can't hurt anyone else. That's gotta count for something." Sarah nodded as they turned to leave. Behind them, the courthouse loomed against the gray sky, a testament to the countless stories of justice and tragedy it had witnessed over the years. As they walked back to their car, Sarah said quietly, "It counts. For Jennifer, it counts." Lessons from the tragedy. The courthouse steps were nearly empty by the time Sarah Calloway and Mike Harrington stepped out. A soft drizzle began to fall, washing away the remnants of the day, whispers from the press, tears from loved ones, traces of another trial that had ended but would leave its scars behind. They moved slowly, their strides quiet at first, neither speaking. Finally it was Mike who broke the silence. "You know, it's one thing to chase these cases, to hunt down the evidence, to piece together how one person's life spiraled so far out of control," he said, adjusting the collar of his coat against the cold. "But when it's all finished, it almost never feels like it's actually over." Sarah glanced up, her expression pensive. "Because it isn't over. Not for the people left behind, not for us." Mike didn't argue. He shoved his hands into his coat pockets instead, his shoulders hunched forward as if he was trying to shelter himself from more than just the rain. "Do you ever think about it? You know, what might have been different?" His voice was softer now, less the hardened detective and more the man beneath the badge. Sarah tightened her grip on the notepad she held, her fingers absently brushing against the worn leather cover. She stopped walking, turning her gaze toward the gray horizon, where the courthouse loomed behind them like a silent adjudicator. "Every time," she admitted, "I think about what would have happened if Jennifer had just walked away sooner, or if anyone had spoken up when they saw the signs. One phone call from a neighbor, a friend, her sister. It's hard not to get caught up in the what-ifs. But," she added, her voice harder now, "that didn't happen, and that's the part that stings the most." Mike nodded grimly, his features tightening. She was shouting for help the only way she knew how, in those letters, in what she told her sister. And no one really heard her until it was too late. "It wasn't just her cries for help," Sarah countered, the anger in her voice now unmistakable. "It was everything about this case. Miller didn't wake up one day and decide to snap. He had patterns, warning signs, behaviors, years of unresolved anger and entitlement that just sat there festering, and people knew about it. They saw it but ignored it because it didn't seem serious enough until the worst possible outcome happened." Her words hung in the air for a moment, carried by the soft rhythm of raindrops tapping on the sidewalk. "I think about how many times this happens," she continued. "How many people get caught in relationships like this? How many victims are afraid to leave, or think they can fix someone who's already beyond the point of redemption?" Mike sighed, taking a step to stand next to her instead of a few paces apart. "Yeah, and every time we see it, we keep asking the same damned question. Why didn't they leave? Why didn't they get help?" "It's the wrong question," Sarah replied immediately, her voice steady but full of resolve. Her eyes flicked toward him, sharp beneath the overhanging shadows of her coat's hood. "The better question is, why does someone like Charles Miller turn into what he became? Why is it that men like him feel entitled to destroy someone just because they lose control of their fragile egos? If we don't start addressing that," she shook her head, "we'll just keep playing cleanup." A long silence stretched between them, only the faint sounds of the city moving on in the background, the murmur of cars, a distant honk, the squeak of wet tires, filled the space. "I know what you're saying." Mike shifted his weight, his voice dipping lower. "But you can't fix the world, Sarah, not all of it. We get the cases, we do the work, we catch these guys so they don't hurt anyone else. That has to be enough, right?" Sarah's lips tugged into a faint, weary smile. "That's the story we keep telling ourselves," she murmured. "But the truth is, we don't just catch these guys. We deal in the aftermath of people deciding to ignore the signs for too long. We put band-aids on bullet holes." Mike frowned but didn't argue. He could see it, the weight Sarah carried. It wasn't just Jennifer's case, it was the dozens that came before and the ones they both knew were coming after. By the time they reached the police station, the quiet tension between them had shifted into something heavier, less sharp, more settled, like the aftershock of a quake. Sarah opened the door to her office, the soft creak of the hinges breaking the silence. On her desk sat the closed case file for Jennifer Collins, a thick accordion of evidence, pictures and notes detailing months of pain and perseverance. Mike lingered in her doorway, arms crossed, watching her. "You're not letting this one go, are you?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "No," Sarah replied simply. "Because it's not just about Miller, it's about why we keep ending up in interrogation rooms, sitting across from someone who crossed that unthinkable line." Mike stepped inside, his boots leaving faint marks on the damp floor. "And what do you think this one taught us?" Sarah ran her fingers along the edge of the file, then sighed. "That everything can look fine on the surface. Miller wasn't some monster hiding out in the dark. He was a guy who got away with small things for years. He knew how to fly under the radar, how to look harmless until someone pushed him too far. It's almost scarier than the ones who wear their evil on their sleeves." "And Jennifer?" Mike asked softly. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes tired but unwavering. "That no matter how strong or kind someone is, it only takes one person, one wrong decision, to pull them into a storm they can't escape from." "Yeah," Mike murmured, leaning against her desk, "but you did all you could for her. You got her justice. That counts for something." "It does," Sarah agreed. "But justice doesn't bring her back. And it doesn't fix the damage left behind for her family, for her sister, for the people who loved her." She paused, her voice growing quieter. "I think it needs to be about more than justice." Mike raised an eyebrow. "What are you getting at?" "A system that actually protects people," Sarah said firmly. "More education, more resources, more conversations about emotional abuse and manipulation before it turns into violence. People see it as this private thing, something taboo to talk about, and by the time anyone pays attention, someone's in a grave and someone else is locked away. It's too late. The room fell silent again, though this time the weight felt more like determination than defeat. Outside the rain began to lighten, its rhythm growing gentler as if the world itself were catching its breath. "You're not just talking as a detective anymore," Mike said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You're talking like someone who wants to change the damn system." "Maybe I am," Sarah replied, closing the case file before looking back at him. "But we can only start small, with cases like Jennifer's, by making sure her story isn't forgotten, even when we move on to the next one." Mike tipped his head and stepped back toward the door. "Well, as long as you don't expect me to start giving motivational speeches, I think you're onto something." Sarah laughed softly, the sound light, but weary. "Don't worry, I can handle the speaking part." As Mike left her office and the sound of his footsteps faded into the hallway, Sarah stared at the closed file one last time. She placed her hand on it briefly, as if saying a silent goodbye. "Rest now, Jennifer," she whispered. "Your story won't disappear." With that, she turned off the light, leaving the file on her desk as a reminder that the lessons in tragedy were often the hardest to hold, but also the most important to share.